want to invite you tonight to open up in your Old Testament to 2 Chronicles chapter 18. 2 Chronicles chapter 18. It may take a minute to get there. That is one of those places in our Bibles where the pages still kind of stick together because we don't go there very often. But I want us to take our study tonight from this particular chapter. You know, one thing you can't help but notice when you read through all the way through the Bible, rather than just kind of hitting the highlights along the way, is that not everything that is found in the Bible is necessarily easy to understand. And that's kind of an understatement, isn't it? If you're reading through the Bible this year, if you've been going through our one-year Bible schedule, I wouldn't be surprised if there have been times when you've thought to yourself, you know, I'm not really sure what's going on there. I'm not really sure what that means. And there may even be a few times when you've thought to yourself, this is just weird. I don't know what to do with this. And so in our study this evening, I want us to talk about one of these passages. It's one of the difficult passages of the Old Testament. It's from yesterday's Old Testament reading in 2 Chronicles. And that book deals with primarily the southern kingdom of Judah. You know, the 1st and 2nd Kings kind of does both the northern and the southern kingdom, but 1st and 2nd Chronicles focuses primarily on the southern kingdom. And what we're going to find is that this story takes place in the section of the book that deals with the reign of King Jehoshaphat. He is a pretty good king. But it also involves King Ahab of Israel, and he was not. And so it's going to be a little bit of a lengthy passage, but I want us to take the time this evening to go ahead and read through it. We won't be able to talk in detail about everything that we're going to read here, but let's go ahead and set the background for it by reading in 2 Chronicles chapter 18, beginning in verse 1. It says, Now Jehoshaphat had great riches and honor, and he made a marriage alliance with Ahab. After some years, he went down to Ahab in Samaria, and Ahab killed an abundance of sheep and oxen for him and for the people who were with him, and induced him to go up against Ramoth Gilead. Ahab, king of Israel, said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, Will you go up, or will you go with me to Ramoth Gilead? And he answered him, I am as you are, and my people as your people. We will be with you in the war. And Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, Inquire first for the word of the Lord. And then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, 400 men, and said to them, Shall we go to battle against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain? And they said, Go up, for God will give it into the hand of the king. But Jehoshaphat said, Is there not here another prophet of the Lord, of whom we may inquire? And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, There is yet one man by whom we may inquire of the Lord, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, but I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but always evil. And Jehoshaphat said, Let not the king say so. And then the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, Bring quickly Micaiah, the son of Imlah. And now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, were sitting on their thrones, arrayed in their robes, and they were sitting at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying before them. And Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, made for himself horns of iron and said, Thus says the Lord, with these you shall push the Syrians until they are destroyed. And all the prophets prophesied so, and said, Go up to Ramoth Gilead and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king. And the messenger who went to summon Micaiah said to him, Behold, the words of the prophets with one accord are favorable to the king. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favorably. But Micaiah said, As the Lord lives, what my God says, that I will speak. And when he had come to the king said to him, Micaiah, shall we go to Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall I refrain? And he answered, Go up and triumph. They will be given into your hand. But the king said to him, How many times shall I make you swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? And he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master. Let each return to his home in peace. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, Did I not tell you that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil? And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, the king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing, and another said another. And then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. Now, therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster concerning you. And then Zedekiah, the son of Chenaanah, came near and struck Micaiah on the cheek and said, which way did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you? And Micaiah said, behold, you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide yourself. And the king of Israel said, seize Micaiah and take him back to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, thus says the king, put this fellow in prison and feed him with meager rations of bread and water until I return in peace. And Micaiah said, if you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me. And he said, hear all you peoples. And so the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you wear your robes. And the king of Israel disguised himself, and they went into battle. And now the king of Syria had commanded the captains of his chariots, fight with neither small nor great, but only with the king of Israel. As soon as the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat, they said, it is the king of Israel. And so they turned to fight against him. And Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him. And God drew them away from him. For as soon as the captains of the chariots saw that it was not the king of Israel, they turned back from pursuing him. But a certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. Therefore he said to the driver of his chariot, turn around and carry me out of the battle, for I am wounded. And the battle continued that day. And the king of Israel was propped up in his chariot, facing the Syrians until evening. And then he died at sunset. Before we're done this evening, I want us to talk about what I think are some very practical lessons that I think we find in this passage. But what I want us to do as we begin this evening is I want us to just talk about the difficult part of the story. And the difficult part of this text is found in Micaiah's explanation of what was happening here, which he summed up with these words in verse 22. Now therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you. And so if we're being honest about that, this passage seems to suggest that God's doing something here that is contrary to his very nature as revealed. And it looks like God is the source of the lie that these prophets are going to tell, doesn't it? And yet we know from what is said in other places, like Numbers chapter 23 and verse 9, that God is not man that he should lie. Or as the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 6 and verse 18, it is impossible for God to lie. And so how do you reconcile all of that? How do you put all of that together? If I were you, I'll just go ahead and tell you, full disclosure, I wouldn't necessarily plan to have every question resolved in your mind tonight before we walk away. But I do think maybe we can point out a few things that will help us with this. There's one principle of Bible study that we can't stress enough. It's that we need to interpret difficult passages of Scripture in light of clear passages of Scripture, not the other way around. And so if the Bible clearly says it's impossible for God to lie, then I'll just go ahead and tell you this. It's impossible for God to lie. And we need to let that guide us in our understanding of the passage that we're trying to look at this evening. And if our understanding of this passage from 2 Chronicles suggests that God was lying, then that's probably the first clue that we're not understanding what's going on here. Does that make sense? Is that as a baseline? And so with that in mind, there are several things I think we need to recognize about the words that Micaiah spoke to King Ahab. When you look at verse 18 again. Verse 18. Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting upon his throne, and all the host of heaven standing on his right hand and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab? the king of Israel, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead. And one said one thing, and one said another, and then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. And one thing I think we need to understand about what is said here is that Micaiah was, he was relating what he saw in a vision. And visions were often symbolic. In other words, I don't know that we're to take everything that is said here absolutely literally. That this is, what Micaiah is doing is he's giving us a transcript of an actual conversation that took place in heaven. And in some ways, I think visions are often a lot like the parables of Jesus. They speak in human terms about spiritual realities, but we're not really supposed to, kind of pick them apart and take every last detail and make that mean something. And so if we're to take everything in this vision at face value, then we also have to conclude that God didn't even know what was going to happen. And he didn't know who was going to do it. I mean, that's what it kind of looks like, right? But in reality, God knows all things. He is omniscient, and he doesn't have to ask questions. He knows answers. And so you can see that this is presenting in human terms, or presenting it in a human way to reveal a spiritual reality. Those human terms, though, are not meant to be pressed too far. And so this vision is meant to basically paint a picture for us. That is to teach us some important principles. And what we learn from this vision is that it was God's will to bring judgment upon Ahab. No doubt about that. And then he did that. And he did that at least in part through the efforts of a lying spirit. And it makes it clear that God is ultimately the one who is in control of this entire situation. But it really also makes it clear that he's not the source of the lie. That's the picture that's painted. But what causes some people trouble is that Micaiah told Ahab there in verse 22, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of these your prophets. But what did he mean by that? Did he mean that literally, that God caused that? And I'll just go ahead and tell you this evening, I don't think he did. You see, the biblical writers sometimes spoke as though God was actively doing something, when in reality, God was permitting something to be done. And here's the thing, we don't talk like that. We don't use that kind of terminology. We don't speak in that way. It is confusing to us. But that kind of thing is found all through the Bible. And so, for example, you go back to the book of Exodus for just a moment. Exodus chapter 5. If you recall, when Moses first went to Pharaoh about letting the Israelites go, Pharaoh actually made things more difficult for them. And rather than providing them with the materials they would need to make bricks, that they were required to make, he made them gather all of the materials themselves, and yet he still required the same number of bricks to be made. And so Moses went back to the Lord in Exodus chapter 5 and verse 22 and says, "O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." Moses said God did evil, when really, in reality, he just permitted Pharaoh to do evil to them. He didn't intervene. He didn't fix the problem. And so can you see what I mean when I say that the Bible sometimes speaks as though God actively does something, when really he's just permitting something to be done? God can stop anything he chooses to stop. He is not only omniscient, he is omnipotent. But he allows many things to take place that are ultimately not in keeping with his revealed will, what he says he wants people to do and what he wants people to be. And he could use even things like that to further his purposes. And he does that here with King Ahab. But it doesn't mean that he was responsible for the actions of those who operated contrary to the principles of truth and righteousness. And so God permitted Ahab to hear what he wanted to hear. But the thing is, and here's what stands out in this chapter and what we need to see, and that is that he also made sure that Ahab heard the truth. Did you notice that in what we read? That's one of the interesting things about this chapter. People sometimes want to charge God with spreading misinformation here when they look at what is said, but that's really hard to reconcile with the fact that God made sure that Ahab had all of the facts. And whatever else we might be able to say about what was going on here, it's important for us to recognize that God wanted Ahab to know the truth. And he told Ahab the truth. He told Ahab exactly what was going to happen. And so, yes, there was a lying spirit who misled the false prophets, but the Lord revealed that to Ahab through Micaiah. And Micaiah tells him that's what's going on here. That's what's happening here. You see that in verse 22. And so these false prophets told Ahab that the Lord had given Ramoth Gilead into his hand, but the Lord revealed to him and tells him in essence, that's not actually true. They are telling you a lie. He would go up and he would fall at Ramoth Gilead, as it says in verse 19. And that's what Micaiah meant when he said to him in verse 16, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. That was the reality of what was going to take place. If God had really wanted to deceive Ahab, he wouldn't have revealed what was going to happen through Micaiah. He wouldn't do that. And so what's so strange to me about this story is that Ahab had all the information he needed to make the right choice. It was laid out before him. And he just chose to ignore it. In fact, when I look at what is said, it seems to me that there may be even a sense in which he knew what the truth was, but it didn't line up with what he wanted to do. So he just tried to get around it. And so when Micaiah was first asked about whether or not Ahab and Jehoshaphat should go up and fight at Ramoth Gilead, he replies sarcastically, I think. I'd love to hear the tone of his voice. Go up in triumph. They'll be given into your hand. Verse 14. And yet what's interesting to me is that Ahab seems to know that's not the real answer. He responds by saying to him in verse 15, how many times shall I make you swear that you speak to me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? It's almost like he's saying, I know that's not the truth. He knew it wasn't true the whole time. But when Micaiah told Ahab the truth, guess what? Ahab didn't like it. In fact, he had Micaiah thrown in prison. But it seems to me he didn't really dismiss it completely. And do you want to know how I know that? Because he changed his plans, didn't he? He didn't just go out to battle. He just say, let's put on the gear and let's get out there and let's get this fight because we know we're going to be victorious. He said, let's go, and I'm not going to do the right thing. I'm going to take all this to heart. But I tell you what, I'm going to disguise myself. I will disguise myself and go into battle, he says in verse 29. Why? Because he believes that the message of Micaiah was true, he's going to die. And so he's like, I'll change it up. I'll fool them. I'll put on some other kind of gear. And I don't know what he thought that would accomplish. I'll just go ahead and tell you what. You might be able to hide from the Syrians, but you can't hide from the Lord. And Ahab learned that lesson the hard way. In verse 33, a certain man, we don't know, this guy's just somebody, and he draws his bow at random, and he struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. Why? Because God had determined that that was going to happen that day. It didn't have to be, we know, hey, there he is, he's the king of Israel. Hey, you go take care of him. It looked random. But that's what the Lord said. You can ignore what the Lord says, but you can't evade the consequences that come from doing that. And so with the time we have remaining this evening, I'd like for us to change directions just a little bit. I hope that what we've talked about up to this point has kind of helped you to maybe have a little better understanding of this, what is admittedly a difficult passage. But we don't want to get so caught up in the difficult parts of this passage that we fail to learn the lessons that we're meant to learn from it. And so we have to guard against letting what we don't know about this passage keep us from, taking to heart what we do know about it. And so when you first read this passage with all this talk about lying spirits and false prophets, it might seem like there's not a whole lot in this for us today. But that's not really true. These events may come from another time and another place, but the principles involved are just as valid today as they were then. And so Ahab was enticed by a false narrative, even though he was presented with the truth. Because that false narrative is what he wanted to hear. He wanted what was false. And I don't know a greater danger that we face today than the one that we see in this passage. And the New Testament warns us all through about the same principle. When the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he said to him in verse 3, the time's coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions and will turn away from listening to the truth. It's not that they won't hear it, they just don't want it. Paul didn't write those words to deal specifically, with the problems of our own day, but it would be difficult to find words that are more applicable, wouldn't it? Is that not what we see taking place all around us? And so the people that Paul was talking about here, they were religious people. In fact, they would have claimed to be Christians. The problem was that they didn't love the truth, and they weren't willing to listen to the truth. That doesn't necessarily mean that the truth was never spoken in their presence. It simply means they weren't willing to accept it. They didn't want to hear it. And that's why they gathered people around them, put people around them who just tell them what they wanted to hear, just like Ahab with his 400 false prophets. And so we sometimes say things like, I liked that message. Or maybe at times we even say things like, I didn't like that message. And when we say things like that, I'll just go ahead and tell you, we need to be careful. And we need to be careful either way. And we need to be careful that we're not only listening to the things that we want to hear and the things that we like. Because if there's one thing reading through the Bible will teach you, it's that those who tell you the truth are not always going to tell you what you want to hear. It's just not how that works. They'll tell you what you need to hear, and they'll do it whether it's pleasant or not. That's what we see in the Scriptures. And so the alternative is far too dangerous. When Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 10, he talked about people who would perish, he says, because they refused to love the truth and so be saved. They refused that. And that's what's at stake here. He went on to say in the next two verses that God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may all be condemned who do not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And that's another one of those passages that sounds like God's responsible for doing something that we wouldn't necessarily associate with him, sending a strong delusion upon people so that they'll believe what is false. And I think that's the same principle we were talking about earlier with Ahab and his false prophets. Paul is speaking as though God is actively sending the strong delusion, but really he just permits it to be done. He lets people be deluded if that's what they want. And so God's not responsible for the strong delusion, but he lets people be deluded if they don't love the truth. That's what Paul's trying to say. And we live in a world where there are counterfeits, things that are not real. And some people prefer those counterfeits to the truth. That never turns out well. Never. And so if we don't want the truth, here's the thing. God will permit some other message to be presented to us, one that's in keeping with what we want to hear. And he still makes the truth available. It's still there. But he will let us believe the lie if that's what we are determined to believe. And what that says is that there is a responsibility placed on us, squarely on our shoulders. And that's why the biblical writers consistently encourage their readers to respond in the right way to God's word and to reject the teaching of those who didn't teach it. And so we read James chapter 1, verse 21. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone's a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and he goes away, and at once he forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Or as the Apostle Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Or as the Apostle John would say in the little short letter that he wrote we call 2 John, verse 9, everyone who goes on ahead and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever abides in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting, for whoever greets him takes part in his wicked works. And of course, that's not just a New Testament principle, is it? That principle has been stated again and again and again and again. The wise man, about 3,000 years ago, give or take, put it this way in Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 23. Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom, instruction, and understanding. That's the obligation that's been placed upon us. And so I want to ask you a question tonight. Have you bought the truth? Are you hanging on to that investment? It's not always easy to do, but it's always worth it. That's the kind of people God expects us to be. If you're here tonight and you owe some duty to the Lord, maybe you have, as you've looked at what the Scriptures say, tried to come to terms with, what does He expect from me? If that's something you don't know the answer to, come and see me. Let's talk about those things. Let's open our Bibles and let's just look at what God says, because we live in the midst of a world where all kinds of answers are given, but not all of them are right. The Lord would say, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. People in our world today think that's not it. Whoever believes and is saved will be baptized, is the way our world often sees that. But that's not what the Lord said. So if you've never obeyed the gospel, then why not do that tonight? We can help you in some way. We ask you to come as we stand and as we sing.